This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're exploring the future of mayoral control of the New York City school system. And our guest is Kamar Samuels, an educator who's moved up the ranks in the Big Apple and was tapped in January by Mayor Zohran Mamdani to serve as Chancellor of the New York City Public Schools. Thanks for making the time, Chancellor.
Thanks for having me, man.
So given your resume as an educator, a middle school principal, a superintendent, what has been your experience with mayoral control, and have you always been supportive of the model?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me again. Yes, I've always been supportive of the model because I've seen where it's beneficial to kids, it's beneficial to a system where you know exactly where the buck stops. And I've seen so many initiatives in my time in DOE that's been spurred by mayoral control. In fact, I became a principal during the small schools movement when they really tried to create a lot of small schools so that you could have really good relationships with young people in schools, and mayoral control was a big part of that movement.
Well, before embracing mayoral control of the New York City public school system, then candidate Zohran Mamdani had some reservations about the system, citing a lack of meaningful input from parents, teachers, and other stakeholders. How do you incorporate the feedback of those stakeholders into decision-making moving forward in a way that, it's not just checking a box, that it's not just falling on deaf ears before ultimately making whatever decision that you and the de facto board wants to make?
Yeah, so I believe that mayoral control and real parent input, parent voice, those things are not mutually exclusive.
Okay.
I think you can have both of those things. What I've done and throughout my career is ensure that I hit the ground listening, like I've already done in this actually as Chancellor. And so as a superintendent, for example, I would hit the ground listening and hear what the major challenges were in a particular district. And then once I did that, I would go back to parents with potential ideas that they could give me feedback on, right? And I think when parents feel that they're part of the decision-making process, that's when they feel truly valued, and not when you have your idea and you just come to them for a rubber stamp.
Where is that line, though, of soliciting feedback and weighing it and ultimately saying, I understand what you're saying, but we have a different vision, or people are saying something different? Because at the end of the day, if you're not doing what all the parents and teachers might want, which might not even be a monolith, there are always going to be people who are unhappy with the direction and are going to bring up that complaint about, well, you're not listening to us.
Yeah, so that's the complexity of the work, right? And again, it's really making sure that you're there listening so that you understand what the major issues are, what the pain points are, what the things you're trying to solve for are, so that when you put forth a plan, even if it doesn't meet all of even if everybody doesn't agree, they respect the process. And, I've seen that over time with community schools, for example. When we first started community schools in the city, not everybody knew what it was. Now it's exploded. Like, there are more than 400 community schools across the city. People love it, and you can't do that without mayoral control. When we think about how we're doing our literacy curriculum, when we first started it, people were skeptical. Now, the vast majority of families love the fact that our kids are making significant progress in literacy. So I think some of these things people might disagree, but again, if you make them feel a part of this process, because they are, right? If you genuinely set up a process where you're taking feedback and making some shifts as a result of that feedback, I think that's truly, truly important to families.
Another point you made in your budget testimony is that, quote, mayor accountability is crucial. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what does meaningful accountability look like?
Yeah, so our mayor has a robust plan, especially around universal childcare. And so we have to do big things. He wants to do big things. I want to do these big things for our families, especially for our working families who childcare is incredibly expensive in the city. And so if he does it and moves forward with his plan, he should be able to say, this is what we did. And if we don't, families should be able to say, why didn't it happen? And you need that level of accountability in a city like ours to make sure that the things that we commit to, that we are working hard on and following through on.
Now, for a question about accountability, why do you go to something like the child care expansion and not something that people might naturally gravitate towards, like test results or any sort of other metrics that might be used to assess how teachers are doing or how the students are doing or how the administrators feel about the system?
Yeah, so when we think about accountability, looks different, and there are diverse sets of metrics that you can look at for accountability. The way I view accountability is, number one, you set goals and you need to be held accountable to whether or not you meet those goals. So of course, standardized test scores, that's a part of accountability. If we have these our literacy plan in place, it should produce a certain output, and we want to be held accountable to that. However, I think also if you have a plan in place to reduce the cost of childcare for families, then we should be held accountable to that too.
When it comes to standardized tests, though, do you have any goals, either in the short term or long term, that you'd like to maybe assess the work of mayoral control against?
Yeah, so year over year, we want to see a 5% point increase in ELA scores. That's something that we've committed to. There are several, we're looking at our literacy curriculum across our schools and district and actually implementing it. We saw last year a 7% increase. We want to continue that momentum into the future.
The effort to promote literacy skills among students is something that has been a focus statewide, with the governor talking about that whole science of literacy. What, if anything, are you looking for from the state to promote that, or is it just leave us alone and let us figure out what we're doing here?
No, I think, look, when we think about returning to and ensuring that we have a research-based approach to reading, the science of reading, if you will, and implementation of that. I think it's a collective effort on the part of the state and districts. It's always great when you have alignment from the state, and so we're moving in that direction. We're excited to do it, and we're always partnering with the state on how thinking about our curriculum and our work, just so we're all moving in the right direction.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you for listeners just joining us. This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Kamar Samuels, the Chancellor for the New York City Public Schools. So during your budget testimony, I was struck by how few questions you got about the extension of mayoral control, which is a complete change from what we might have seen in years past, depending on who the mayor or the school chancellor was. I'm curious, though, as you're meeting with lawmakers and making the pitch for a renewal of mayoral control, which is set to expire this summer, what questions are you getting behind closed doors? What reservations or guarantees are people bringing up to you?
Yeah, so look, I think one of the big issues we had, which I mentioned in my testimony, is this implementation of our class size law. And some of the conversation has centered around that. I think people know my history. I am very aggressive, and when it comes to making sure that we utilize our buildings that we have in place and find space for our schools, and everything doesn't have to be an immediate capital strategy. So we have to look at utilizing our buildings very well, and we've been working with the SCA, partnering with them probably for the first time in a very long time. And so once we make sure that we are utilizing our buildings, we can look at the capital strategy, and that's some of the conversations that we've had. So our elected officials know that we are serious about trying to get to the class size mandate.
Is it a game of horse trading? Is it lawmakers saying, hey, I'd love to give you that 4-year extension the governor proposed, but I'd also like to see a little more action on the class size application here? Or are there other things that they're bringing up as well?
Well, I'd say from my perspective, I was always going to approach class size in the way that we're approaching it. And I think many of the lawmakers like that because they see it as a change from what's been before, where there wasn't much energy behind meeting the class size law.
So coming back to that idea of the underutilized class spaces, because that was something you did bring up in your budget testimony, what is the reason why these spaces are not being taken advantage of already? Because I have to imagine you're not the first person to say, hey, we've got the space, why aren't we using it? There's probably a reason why people can't access it.
Yeah, there's a fundamental reason, which part of the reason that we think about affordability in our city is because many families are leaving our city. And so if you have 200,000 kids that have left the city over the last 10 or so years, what's going to happen is that you're going to have schools that are now under enrolled and essentially buildings that have space and
Sure.
and they're not utilized. And so there are opportunities where you have a school that could be a block away that is bursting at the seams, and then you have a school that is under enrolled, and thinking about how you utilize those spaces, I think, is something that's very important to me, because we have to reconcile that before we get to what the capital's building new buildings would look like.
Sure. Well, lastly, during your budget testimony, you also mentioned needing to hire 6,000 new teachers next year. Right now, around the Capitol, there's this push by the teachers union to sweeten pensions benefits for educators hired in the last 16 years. Do you think that could make a difference in your recruitment and retention efforts? And if it is a potential help for your efforts, what do you think about the cost? Because you mentioned the affordability. This would drive up, costs. It would eat into your budgets having to pay for something like that. So how do you think about the pension reform issue?
Yeah, so when I think about recruitment, I think about the fact that we have more, almost double the number of people that have applied to our Teaching Fellows program. Partly, I'd like to claim some credit because I was a teaching fellow myself, and I think they've put that out there. So I think that's what our teachers, potential teachers, are thinking about. How do I get into the classroom? How do I become a good teacher? I'm not sure. I haven't done any surveys on whether they're thinking about the pension system or not.
Well, Michael Mulgrew might mention it to you in some private conversations.
I'm sure he will.
Well, we've been speaking with Kamar Samuels. He is the Chancellor for the New York City Public Schools. Chancellor, thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided in part by the Lawsuit Reform Alliance of New York. Fraud and lawsuit abuse impact car insurance costs for New Yorkers. Reforms are being proposed to mitigate their impact. Information on these reforms is available at keepnewyorkaffordable.org.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell & Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.